Or you can use them to add notes to remind yourself or other developers to do something in the code. So comments are good, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about classes in Python. Classes are extremely important in programming, and they're not specific to Python. In fact, a lot of other programming languages do support the notion of classes. We use classes to define new types. For example, so far, you have learned about the basic types in Python, like numbers, strings, and booleans. These are the basic or simple types in Python. You also learn about a couple of complex types, like lists and dictionaries. While these types are extremely useful, they cannot always be used to model complex concepts. For example, think of the concept of a point or a shopping cart. A shopping cart is not a Boolean. It's not a list. It's not a dictionary. It's a different kind of thing. So we can use classes to define new types to model real concepts. Now, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to define a new type called point. And this new type is going to have methods for working with points. For example, back to our main program, let's create a list, numbers, 1, 2, 3. You know that here, when we type dot, we get access to these functions or methods available in list objects. Now, similar to this, we're going to create a new type called point. This point is going to have methods like move, draw, get, distance from another point. These are the operations that we can perform on points. So let me show you how to do this. We start by defining a class using the class keyword. And right after that, we give our class a name. Now look at the naming convention I have used here. I've capitalized the first letter here. This is what we call Pascal naming convention. So the convention we use for naming our classes is different from the convention we use for naming our variables and functions. For variables and functions, we always use lowercase letters, and we separate multiple words using an underscore. But when naming classes, we don't use an underscore to separate multiple words. Instead, we capitalize the first letter of every word. So in this case, our class has only a single word. If it had multiple words, let's say email client, look, I've capitalized the first letter of every word. Once again, this is called Pascal naming convention, and it comes from the old Pascal language that you might have heard of. So back to our point class. Here we add a colon, which means we're going to define a block. Now in this block, we can define all the functions or methods that belong to points. For example, we can define a function called move for moving a point. Now note that as soon as we type open parentheses, PyCharm automatically adds self here. This is a special keyword, and we're going to get back to this shortly. So for now, in this method, let's print move on the terminal. Now let's define another method like draw. So define draw. And in this method, let's print draw on the terminal. Now let's remove the indentation. We are done with the definition of our point class. So we need to add 2 line breaks. Okay. So with this class, we defined a new type. With this new type, we can create new objects. So an object is an instance of a class. A class simply defines the blueprint or the template for creating objects, and objects are the actual instances based on that blueprint. So we could have tens or hundreds of points on the screen. These are the objects or the instances. So to create an object, we type out the name of our class and then call it like a function. This creates a new object and then returns it. So we can store that object in a variable. Let's call that point1. There you go. Now when we use the dot operator, look, we have these 2 methods that we defined, draw and move. We also have a bunch of other methods that start with 2 underscores. These are called magic methods. We'll look at them later in the course. So now let's call the draw method of our point object and run our program. So you can see draw is printed on the terminal. Now, apart from methods, these objects can also have attributes, and these attributes are like variables that belong to a particular object. For example, here, after we define point1, we can set point1.x to 10 and point1.y to 20. Now we can easily print out these attributes. Let's print point1.x and run our program one more time. Take a look. So the x coordinate of point 1 is 10. Now we can create another object. Let's call that point 2. So point 2, once again, we type out the name of our class and then call it like a function. Now this object is completely different from the first object. So if we print point2.x, look, we get this attribute error because this point object doesn't have an attribute called x. So each object is a different instance of our point class. And here we can assign a value to point2.x. Let's set that to 1 and then run our program. So we can see the x coordinate of point 2 is 1. So to recap, we use classes to define